Good morning to my precious Protestants, my captivating Catholics, and everyone else in between watching. I'm Patrick, but today you can call me Mary Queen of Shots because we're going to be playing a drinking game. We're going to do a shot every time England switches from Catholic to Protestant. You've guessed it, today we're talking about the English Reformation, a very important chapter in British history that still echoes in our society to this day. If you look at the sectarian tensions in Northern Ireland between Unionists, Protestants, and Republicans who are Catholics, this is where it all began. We can't understand the realities of the modern world without looking back at religious tensions of the past. Even if we look at the more recent conflict in Israel-Palestine, their own religious differences and sectarianism is the most important factor driving that war. That's why, when we talk about the Tudors, I think it's foolish to focus just on the juicy bits. Henry's wives, Bloody Mary, the boy King Edward, and then Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. Virgin, was she? If we boil it down to that, we forget about the real driver of change in that time, which was the religious transformation of England. Those factors were arguably the most important to the success of the reigns of each Tudor monarch. They were the factors that distinguished them from each other the most, and in the end, these were the factors that left behind the longest lasting legacy. In the end, it doesn't matter what happened in Henry's bedroom.
Dirty! Filth!
But it does still matter what happened in his churches. So, to understand the dawn of the Anglican Church of England, we do need to understand the sheer power of the Catholic Church in England and across Europe at this time. We're looking at the start of the 16th century here. Henry VII died in 1509, leaving Henry VIII and his children to reign throughout that century, until Elizabeth died in 1603. That means for over 100 years, one family held the power in England, and they certainly didn't shy away from inflicting their own drama on their subjects, of which there were over 4 million by 1600. For context, England's population more than doubled between 1500 and 1650, so it was no mean feat to convert all these people from Catholic to Protestant or vice versa no less than 3 times. Anyway, the key thing to remember is that when Henry VIII took the throne, he became the king, but that didn't make him the number one. The Pope was. The supremacy of the Catholic Church in Rome was the closest thing to a political union seen in Europe until the EU came along almost 500 years later. The Pope was the head of the churches across modern-day Ireland, France, Spain, Portugal, Austria, southern Germany, Poland, and more. Sure, there was definitely conflict and rivalry between these individual kingdoms, but as all these monarchies purported to derive their divine right to rule from God, and God's spokesperson here on earth was believed to be the Pope, when Henry first sat on that throne, he had Pope Julius II to answer to. His reach would have extended into governance, economy, and daily routines of the populace. The church was the largest landowner in Europe, and it collected taxes from the monarchies, and its edicts shaped laws and policies. The Papal States, held by Pope Julius II until 1513, and then by Pope Leo X until 1521, were at a zenith of their influence at this time. Julius II was actually known as the Warrior Pope during his rule, from 1503 until 1513. He exemplified the papal authority that could crown kings and influence the tide of nations. Their reigns coincided with the Renaissance and saw the commissioning of grand projects like the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, which still survives to this day, supporting the arts, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. The Pope was not only a spiritual leader, but a political powerhouse, a powerhouse in the arts. His opinions could alter the balance of power across kingdoms. His court was a hub of diplomacy in Europe, ambassadors from far and wide seeking the Pope's favour. Rome was where it all happened. And it wasn't always Rome, it did move around, it was sometimes in southern France. In England specifically, the church's power was equally pronounced. The clergy were among the elite, their wealth rivaling that of the nobility. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, He held the position of Lord Chancellor, and he was a close advisor to Henry VIII, so that was testament to the church's influence in English politics. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest ranking cleric, pivotal role in matters of the nation, he answered to Rome, not to London. Monasteries and abbeys dotted all around the landscape. Those were centres of learning and charity. So the church held the knowledge, the science, all the books. They were looked after by the monks. Monks were often the most literate, learned people. Universities like Oxford and Cambridge were actually under the patronage of the Pope. The church dictated the curriculum, what you would learn. That's how much power the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, had all across Europe. It influenced all facets of society. Although that was the state in which we find the Roman Catholic Church at the start of the 16th century, as we can see from this here map, Rome had begun to lose its stronghold on Western Christianity by 1550. If we look closely, we can see Protestantism had taken a hold in many nations, notably across Scandinavia and northern Germany, as well as England, Wales, the northern regions of Ireland. That's Lutheranism across Scandinavia and the beginnings of Anglicanism here. But how did this happen so quickly? You're talking, in 100 years, a massive religious transformation. First of all, let's look at John Wycliffe and the Lollards. In the 14th century, John Wycliffe, who was born around 1330 in Yorkshire, emerged as a formidable early voice against the church's authority. His translation of the Bible into English began as an early Christian reformer movement called the Lollards. At this point, the Bible and Mass were entirely in Latin, and only 20% of men were literate in English anyway. There's no doubt that the availability of this material began to spark a turning point in England's understanding of religion. It allowed a personal connection with the Bible, and it lessened the Catholic Church power in ruling by doctrine and dogma. You believe what you're told to believe, not what you discovered for yourself. This was obviously controversial, and Pope Gregory XI, as well as the Archbishop of Canterbury, publicly condemned his ideas in 1382. They issued a warrant for his arrest, which never actually came to fruition. The appetite for pursuing heretics waxed and waned depending on the monarch. Richard seemed to tolerate him, and it was only 40 years after his death that Henry IV decided to condemn Wycliffe and burn his books in an attempt to suppress the Lollard movement. The late medieval period also saw a crescendo of anti-clerical sentiment as the church's wealth and the perceived corruption of the clergy sparked widespread discontent. The clergy were often seen as exploiting their positions for personal gain, leading to demands for reform. This period was also rife with events like the Black Death, the Peasants' Revolt, that fueled the fire of anti-clericalism, and it's the reason Europe had such an appetite for reform. They weren't happy with the ruling class, and the ruling class was mostly priests. This is in the context of what we now call Renaissance humanism, where leading scientists, artists and scholars began turning to the study of humanity and the classics, rather than drawing all of the answers from the church and the idea of God in the Bible. The Renaissance, a period of cultural rebirth from the 14th to the 16th centuries, was ignited by figures like Petrarch, who sought out ancient Roman and Greek manuscripts and they championed the study of humanity. This movement emphasised personal virtue, civic responsibility, that challenged the church's dominance in defining moral and ethical standards. In the context of the scriptures, they tended to consider a personal connection with the Bible rather than a prescribed interpretation that was given to you by the clergy. Then we have Martin Luther. On 31st of October 1517, Martin Luther, who hailed from Saxony, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. This act is widely regarded as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Luther's excommunication in 1521 and his defence at the Diet of Worms in 1521 underscored his pivotal role in religious reform. The criticisms of the Catholic Church during this era weren't just whispers, they were a robust movement that had begun to reach the British Isles. However, Protestantism still had to be conducted in secret. It took a major falling out between Hampton Court Palace and Rome for any official change to begin to British religion. That journey begins with King Henry VIII's quest for a male heir. By 1527, his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed to produce a son. Desperate for an heir, he sought an annulment, citing Leviticus to claim his marriage was cursed because Catherine was his brother's widow. The Pope refused, as you could probably guess. Catholics don't like divorce. And he was influenced by political pressures, and this led Henry to break with Rome. That set up the stage for our religious upheaval. Parliament played a crucial role in this Henrician Reformation. The Reformation Parliament, until 1536, passed laws that abolished the papal authority in England and declared Henry to be the head of the Church of England. He was finally number one. This shift transferred power from the Pope to the English crown, and that intertwined the monarchy with ecclesiastical authority. The wealth of the monasteries had long been eyed by the crown. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry, with the approval of Parliament, dissolved England's monasteries. He absorbed their income, their assets. This not only filled the royal coffers, but it signified a clear departure from Catholic tradition. The dissolution of the monasteries didn't go down well. It sparked widespread unrest. In 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace, the largest rebellion against Tudor authority, saw 30,000 northerners march in protest. They demanded the restoration of the monasteries and the Catholic faith. Despite initial promises to negotiate, the revolt was suppressed, the leaders executed. As we all know, Henry went on to marry 5 more times, divorcing twice in total, a stark departure from Catholic doctrine at the time. A clear sign that the English king was now in charge of his own church. So that's it. England is now Protestant. Time for a shot, girls.
No, stop! Not yet.
Why? Okay. I've been told that's actually one of the biggest oversimplifications in English history. At the time of Henry's death in 1547, it seems that England was still a Catholic state. So we will save that shot for later. It was a Catholic state, it was just no longer in full communion with the Roman Catholic Church. While the traditional narrative may suggest a swift Protestant conversion, the reality was far more complex. The Church of England under Henry retained many Catholic traditions, much to the frustration of reformers like Cranmer. Yet the seeds of Protestantism were undeniably sown. Despite the dissolution of monasteries and the establishment of royal supremacy, the core of English religious life remained fundamentally Catholic. The clergy, particularly in rural areas, continued to practice and preach along traditional lines, often still in Latin, and the populace largely held onto their Catholic beliefs. They were still confessing their sins, asking for forgiveness, eating the Holy Communion, drinking the wine. Henry made no attempt to persecute Catholicism. Anne Boleyn, an important influence in Henry at the time of his decision to break from Rome, would not really be categorised as a Protestant. I'd say she was a reformist Catholic. She wasn't a secret Protestant like we all like to believe. His surviving wife, Catherine Parr, was a Protestant, but also she was particularly outspoken and politically active for a consort queen at the time. That was dangerous. Her controversial religious views marked her as dangerous, and a plot for her arrest was drawn up. Henry only put a stop to this when she disarmed him. She pled for forgiveness, she begged for forgiveness. She was forced to hide her beliefs for survival. And that points to Catholicism's enduring influence in Henry's later years. It was still a taboo to be Protestant. However, the influence of Protestantism was growing, especially in regions like East Anglia, where European Protestant Lutheran immigrants had settled. The nobility too showed either support for the reforms or at least a reluctance to oppose them. So it was slowly changing, but it wasn't there yet. But when he died, that's when those Protestant factions come to the forefront. A key legacy of Henry's, though, was the power vacuum he left behind by his rather complicated line of succession. The fact that his male heir was still a young boy made it even easier for those reformative forces at court to exert their influence on a vulnerable young king. Edward's reign, though brief, was therefore marked by significant shifts in ecclesiastical policy and practice. Under the guidance of his regents, chiefly the Duke of Somerset and later the Duke of Northumberland, Edward's England saw a more decisive move towards Protestantism. The introduction of the Book of Common Prayer by Thomas Cranmer laid the foundation for English Protestant worship. Its two versions, first in 1549 and a more radical revision in 1552, standardised the liturgy and made services comprehensible to the common people by using English instead of Latin for the first time. The Chantries Act of 1547 that dissolved religious institutions that offered masses for the dead, redirecting their wealth to the crown and funding educational and religious reform. Drafted by Cranmer again, the 42 Articles of 1553 were a doctrinal statement that defined Reformed theology, including justification by faith, and it rejected transubstantiation. Now, what does that mean? In Christian theology, transubstantiation is the conversion of the substance of the Eucharistic elements into the body and the blood of Christ. Only the appearances of bread and wine remaining. So a Catholic would say body of Christ, blood of Christ, and they believe that the Eucharist is Jesus' flesh and his blood. In the Anglican Church today, and from the time of that law, Anglicans will believe that it's represented. They don't believe that they are actually eating the body and blood of Christ. So if you hear that word, transubstantiation, that's what it means, and it was contentious at the time. The Pope would have seen this as highly sacrilegious. That's very controversial. The Reformers also sanctioned the marriage of the clergy, a stark departure from Catholic tradition of clerical celibacy. Suddenly, a priest could have a wife. Edward's reign also witnessed the beginnings of widespread iconoclasm, that is, the destruction of religious images and relics, which were seen as idols by the Protestant reformers. No Virgin Mary statues anymore. His reign, though short-lived, irrevocably altered the religious landscape of England. His legacy is a testament to the power of regency, because if he was an adult, all of those Protestant advisors wouldn't have been able to exert their influence as much. If Henry had an adult heir, if he'd lived a little bit longer, maybe the religious landscape of England at the time would have been a bit different. So, Catholics and prosies, I hope you're in a party mood, because it's already time for another shot. These actually aren't shots of milk, it's a pina colada shot. It's lovely. So Mary Tudor ascended the throne in 1553, following Edward's unexpected death that we all know about, age 15. In a last-ditch attempt to preserve his reforms, he was made to sign a will on his deathbed nominating Lady Jane Grey as his heir, and removing his sisters again from the line of succession, even though Henry had restored them. Unfortunately, her claim quickly dwindled in support, and after just 9 days, Mary was on the throne, as planned, a staunch Catholic. That's where I've done my shot. England was Catholic again, and Wales. Mary embarked on a mission to restore Catholicism. Her first act was to suspend the Second Act of Uniformity and reintroduce the Mass, a move met with minimal public resistance by a public who were already divided and confused by the recent changes. They now knew that they just had to bend to the will of the royals. It wasn't about their own beliefs. In October 1553, a parliamentary discussion led to the Statute of Repeal, which began the dismantling of Protestantism within the Church of England systematically. This shift set the stage for the re-establishment of papal supremacy. The Pope was in charge again. A controversial move, even among the nobility, because they started to profit from English royal supremacy. It was better for them not to have to pay taxes to the Pope. While Mary initially misinterpreted her coronation's popularity as support for her religion, the reality was more nuanced. The populace's reaction to the return of Catholic practices was mixed, with some embracing the old faith, others resisting. There was pluralism in religion, but Mary wouldn't accept this. This resistance culminated in her famous persecutions known as the Marian persecutions. Over 280 dissenters were executed, often burned at the stake, earning her the moniker Bloody Mary. Mary's legacy is a testament to the era's religious volatility and the enduring impact of the Reformation, which was clearly an embattled and slow process, not an instant switch. It didn't happen overnight, and it was not as simple as flicking a switch. So when her sister inherits the throne, what does she do? Does she try and flick a switch again, or does she try it and balance out religion? Let's find out. It's time to get pissed. Let's party like it's 1565. Because after a 5-year reign, Mary died childless, leaving her secretly Protestant sister in charge. When Elizabeth ascended to the throne in 1558, she inherited a kingdom deeply divided by religious strife, living in fear. Although Mary had reinstated Catholicism, a substantial number of her subjects remained staunchly Protestant, and a growing faction of Puritans were seeking further reforms. In 59, Elizabeth enacted 2 critical pieces of legislation aimed at unifying the realm under a middle way compromise between both. The Act of Supremacy re-established the monarch as the supreme governor of the church, which is a subtle yet significant change in wording from her father's title as head of the church. This semantic distinction, change in wording, aimed to appease those uncomfortable with conflating the roles of sovereign and religious leader. Simultaneously, the Act of Uniformity sought to standardise religious practice across England. It reintroduced a revised version of the Protestant Book of Common Prayer, while including certain Catholic traditions to foster broader acceptance. So priests could wear their traditional priestly vestments while delivering a Protestant mass. It keeps everyone happy. Elizabeth's approach was one of tolerance and pragmatism. She avoided the extremes and excesses of her predecessors, instead offering a balanced path that largely quelled the religious tumult of the time. The settlement was broadly supported, and few refused to take the oath of loyalty to the Queen, which meant not many executions. However, it did not completely eradicate dissent, as subsequent plots and threats would reveal. Her pragmatic approach was evident in all areas of her rule, and was why she managed to cling on to the throne for so long, allowing England a much needed period of peace. For the most part, her pragmatic approach was evident in all areas of her rule, and that's why she managed to cling on to the throne for so long, allowing England a much needed period of peace, for the most part, and prosperity. Her treatment of Mary Queen of Scots, who was herself a Catholic with her own claim to the throne, is perfect evidence of that. She kept her close for most of her rule, despite their ideological differences, yet she never went as far to interfere in her sister's forced abdication at the hands of Protestant conspirators in Scotland. Although she offered her protection in England for many years, Elizabeth ultimately did decide to have her executed when that threat of a potential Catholic plot became too great. So she was always balancing different forces, and only acted when she really had to. That was classic of her rule. This period not only established the Church of England as it carried on to this day for many hundreds of years, it also laid the groundwork for a national English identity that could for the first time accommodate diverse beliefs. So as she started to expand different parts of the world, pluralism was fine. Still, it wasn't until 1829 that Catholics were fully emancipated in the United Kingdom. For hundreds of years after that, there was a British Empire, which she really started when she started to colonise the New World. Yet still, with all those different creeds and religions, Catholicism was still persecuted to an extent for many hundreds of years afterwards. But there was a pause in those poor relations between Protestants and Catholics. As we conclude our exploration of the English Reformation, it's clear that this wasn't just a historical event, it was a fundamental shift in society, politics and religion. From the dominance of Catholicism to the rise of Protestantism, the journey was marked by power struggles, religious fervour, societal change, Reflecting on those reigns, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, Elizabeth I, it's evident how each monarch left a very different lasting imprint on England's religious landscape. Whether it was Henry's break from Rome, Edward's first steps towards Protestantism, Mary's die-hard Catholicism, or Elizabeth's pragmatic approach of compromise, their decisions shaped the course of English history. In particular, Elizabeth I's approach stands out for its tolerance. By seeking a middle ground between the two varieties of Christianity, she laid the foundation for a more inclusive society, fostering a period of relative stability and prosperity. As we look back on this turbulent era, we are reminded of the enduring impact of religious differences and the importance of tolerance in shaping our world today. The English Reformation may be a chapter from the past, but its legacy continues to resonate if we look at modern society. And that's why, children, we shouldn't forget about it. I could give you a joke about Catherine, but all my ideas are gone.
Nice.
Cue the jokes.